spiritual abuse is a lot harder for people to understand because it's this intangible form of abuse. And so it can feel more slippery for people. Welcome, everyone, to Reclamation, a beEmboldened initiative. I am Naomi. I'm the founder and executive director here at BE, and we exist for those impacted by spiritual abuse. We provide support for the prevention of victimization and revictimization, creating a safe place to ask the hard questions and to heal. Today, our guest is Josh Klein, who is a speaker and author for Free Thinking Ministries with over a decade of experience in local church pastoral ministry as well as public speaking. He brings a focus on engaging the culture with a biblical worldview and specializes in tackling the most pertinent cultural issues of the day and equipping fellow believers in the local church to do likewise. He's married, has 3 young children, and is here today to actually share. Although, obviously, as you can tell, he's got a lot of knowledge he can give us. He's here to share about a personal experience that he had, which I'm so thankful for. It is always a very vulnerable and personal decision to make. And I just feel very honored and privileged when I get to do this with someone. So, Josh, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I'm going to jump right in with the first question and ask, I know that your story took place in connection with the church. Spiritual abuse does happen in other environments. It can happen at home. It can happen in a parachurch organization, different ways that it can look. I know that yours was in connection with the church, but would you start by sharing what was the nature of that connection?
Yeah, so I was on staff with the church for about 6 years, probably about 5 years going into the ordeal. And really what happened was we were a very conservative church, and which is where I kind of fit in. And a lot of homeschool families, which I love. We don't homeschool our kids, but a lot of people do, especially this day and age. And so very conservative. And so we had a few new families come, and I was the youth pastor at the time. And we had a family come and be a part of the youth group. They had a bunch of kids, but their 2 youngest daughters were part of the youth group. And over time, I started noticing some interesting things within the family dynamic, and I wasn't really able to put my finger on it. I hadn't experienced something like that before, and so I remember going to a pastor colleague friend of mine, and I had been doing youth ministry about 10 years at this point. And I remember going to him and saying, what do you do if you're starting to realize that the parents aren't really in the relationship with the kids, and you're having to figure that out. And it's not like non-Christian parents or something that you see as obvious physical abuse, but there's something else going on. And I didn't know where to put my finger on it. And during that time, I was in seminary, and we were taking classes on counseling and spiritual abuse, and the things were just lining up for the type of spiritual abuse that we were talking about. And I started to realize, I think this is what I'm coming into contact with, but I had no training or really understanding of how to deal with it. And so I kind of went through it going, well, the idea for me was, maybe they don't even realize what's going on. It's just a hard family dynamic. So we kind of invested in the family a little bit. My wife and I did. And then at one point, we started to realize that it's much more serious than we thought. And I remember having a conversation with my wife saying, well, what do we do about this? We're not sure. We're like, well, we should probably talk to them. And then about 2 weeks later, we had an episode where the girls they had been taking care of our kids and babysitting and stuff like that, and that's how we'd gotten to know the family. And they were over at our house, and there was a big blow up that happened, and it was something that I had never seen. And so I remember having a conversation with the father and thinking that it went well, only to find out that it didn't go well. And then all of a sudden, elders got involved, and I was put before the elder board, and we were asking questions, and they had logged a whole list of activities that I had done, and all the activities were factually accurate, but they were portrayed in a way that made it look like I was the reason that there was issues in the family, and I had really no clue how to respond to it. And I remember sitting in my basement with a couple of the elders with my wife, and them saying, "Do you want us to just side with you? Like, what do you want?" And me saying, "I just want the truth. Like, that's what I want. The truth to be exposed. I want the family to heal. I want to be a part of helping that." Um, because I thought we were still dealing with some people that everyone has different levels of health, and so I thought, well, maybe there's just some emotionally unhealthy things going on here, and we can walk alongside them. About that time, some surrogates were brought in, and there were anonymous letters written to all the people in the church that were mailed out about things that I didn't even do or say. And then there were other letters written to the board of elders trying to get me to resign because of supposedly things that I was doing to this family. Uh, and we had I'm trying to make a long story short here, but we end up having a couple elder meetings where we're trying to hash out the issues. And I I remember thinking, well, I think that I don't know how to frame this in the way that I see it. And one of my pastoral colleagues that had worked with the family before was like, I see it, and I also don't know how to frame it in the way that people will understand what's actually going on here. And as we're having conversations with the elder board, I started to realize I think that this is going to end up with me losing my position here. Um, Even though now there were mistakes that I made, but as the elders had said, none of them were on the level of sin or things of that nature. Just uh, dealing with a situation I'd never dealt with before, and and I realized I think there's enough people that are now buying this idea that I'm the reason for the dysfunction in the family that I'm going to lose my position. Um, and then the oldest daughter ended up coming on her own. We didn't know her, and spoke to the elder board and changed a lot of their minds. And they realized, oh, there is a rift in this family for some reason. We're not sure what. And one of the things I recognized was that we hesitated to call spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, what it was. We just, dysfunction or disagreements, things of that nature. We didn't name it, and because of that, there was a lot of confusion from the churches, the people in the pews saying, oh, "We don't know exactly what's going on here." People on both sides of the issue. So, long story short, the elders ended up retaining me for another year. A new pastor came in, but because there wasn't this overt calling it what it was, there was still kind of an undercurrent of of a lot of people saying we don't understand what happened here. We think that something fishy's going on, that he's hoodwinked the elder board here. And so when he got a new pastor to come in, and some of them bent his ear, and we ended up having more conversations in the elder board, and it resulted in, after COVID, me losing my position. And then I went on to do free thinking ministries after that. I'm at a church now. But some of the things that I saw were uh, just very odd spiritual or scriptural references. For instance, one of them was that women can't ever leave the home because Jesus goes and prepares a place for us, and so women can't leave the home until they get married because that's the example that Jesus set for us. So women need to stay in the home until they're married, and if they leave the home, they're just women of the world, which is a euphemism for all sorts of deviancy. And it really it wasn't overt. I don't know if you're probably aware of IBLP, Bill Gothard. It wasn't that overt, but it was very influenced by that way of thinking. Men have the men have the leadership, and because of that, women must acquiesce to their demands. And if women stumble into something, it's probably their fault. If men take advantage of a woman, it's probably because the woman was enticing him in some way. And so, in this situation where I decided I don't think that's right. I think uh, there should be more freedom here, and it wasn't in a desire to undermine the family. It was in a desire to advance the true gospel and what Jesus really said. So those are just some examples of what was going on. Um, and there were a lot of other things said about each other and the family and things like that. We left an open invitation to say, "Hey, come and talk to us individually, so we can have a conversation about how we can move forward." And that was never reciprocated. But ultimately, I think uh, it was my unpreparedness and the church's unpreparedness in general to deal with the situation that really didn't help the family or the kids at all. So I guess that was kind of a long, long story, but I think generally speaking, that's what happened. There's a lot of specifics that I could get into, but generally speaking, that's what happened, and that's what led me here to have a conversation with you and have this conversation now.
Yeah,
You
thank
know?
you so much for giving that overview. I want to go back and clarify a few things that are kind of standing out to me just to make sure that I'm
Yeah,
tracking and that, our audience will be able to track as well. Just with some of like, I want to clarify when you were talking about not being able to leave the
yeah,
home, you, I believe the way you're meaning that is not that they were like locked up, but like they weren't supposed to like move out and kind of build their own life, outside of being married and building a life with a
yes,
husband,
yeah, yeah.
right?
Not they weren't like
Okay.
imprisoned. They felt imprisoned,
Yes.
uh, but yeah,
Oh, I
but
bet.
they weren't imprisoned like physically.
Yeah. And so they're attending the church.
Hmm.
Everyone in the family attended the
Uh,
church. Is that right?
Almost everyone. Actually,
Or
the older
basically, okay.
daughter attended for a little while and then was going to a different church. So when she came back, she hadn't been attending the
Okay.
church. Yeah.
Okay. And so they're attending, and that's how you're becoming aware of some of those beliefs. It
Yep.
sounds like the girls are either sharing about it or the parents are making comments, something along those lines.
Yeah, both. I recognized both things.
Okay.
There have been, like I said, there's some specifics that I won't get into, but there were meetings and
Sure.
conversations where it became, it started slow and then it started to become glaringly obvious that something was off here. Yeah.
Yeah. And, well, and you do know, I know that you're going to know this. So there's room, right, for
Yeah.
differences. I know that we're going to be in agreement on that theologically. We've got room on some things. And yet, along the way, we can go too far in a direction or another, and all of a sudden people are at risk of harm.
Yep.
How do you think what was going on with the girls maybe compares or contrasts to what I just
Yeah.
said?
So I think it's like there's room for differences theologically, absolutely. I think what changes either in a family setting or in a church setting, uh, church leadership too, is when those differences are made not because we have a different understanding of scripture necessarily, but because we're using scripture to control or to create a narrative where we can maintain a power dynamic that we don't want to give up. And so that's what I mean by spiritual abuse. It was not that uh, it was not that we had different beliefs and they were open to having conversations. It was different beliefs, and we can't have a conversation about this because if I'm wrong, I'm going to lose my leverage. Theology isn't about leverage; it's about knowing the one true God. John 17:3. And so I think that's where you start to drift into some of those things. And there are obviously heresies as well that come along with that. But when we're talking about spiritual abuse, I think for me that's where the line starts to cross when it becomes, and that's why it's so hard to talk about sometimes because some people can say, well, it's they just have a difference of opinion, and that was what I thought. Uh, but looking back, as I kind of replay in my head, and also as I learned more, It was less about having difference of opinion and more about maintaining a position, if that makes sense.
Right, maintaining that position theologically, but also of control, it
Yeah.
sounds
Yep.
like. Did the girls want help?
They did. They did. And
Yeah.
actually, multiple times in the situation, the question was, are you going to leave like other people when we've kind of cried out for this? And my wife and I decided, no, we're not. We're not going to do that. But by the grace of God, um, and I think most of the mistakes that I made were all because of fear for my position, because I didn't want to. I have a family, right? And I had a position, and
Right.
that was my income, and so the temptation would be the easiest path would have been to say, yeah, they're wrong. They need to become um, obedient and subservient, and then bow out. But I couldn't, in good conscience, do that.
May I ask generally, what was the position of the church? And let me fill that in a little bit. Here's where I'm wondering about this. The families coming to the church, did this church generally disagree with the practices that the family was adhering to? Because if so, kind of by default, the girls would be told something contrary to what the family was teaching. I just see that just creating issues on its own.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that would have been. I know there were people in leadership that disagreed, um, but I think in some facets, the idea of, well, the family has ultimate authority, and so if you hear something contrary at church, your spiritual head isn't the pastor; it's someone else, um, and so you should submit to that. So they were getting conflicting messages, and they weren't sure how to resolve that, and they wanted freedom, um, as they started to see that this isn't the way things have to be, and this isn't the way things God's created them to be. Uh, but I think generally speaking, in this situation at least, maybe specifically speaking, one of the issues as far as with leadership goes is the differences can feel so minute and so small. Um, and then we just kind of go, well, we'll agree to disagree, especially if we decide as leadership that, well, they have the right politics, they have the right essentials, they have the right other things, so I don't want to enter into that space, if that makes sense.
Hmm. Sure. I'm wondering, so as I'm listening to this story, I'm wondering where the line was crossed between, because I'm imagining what some of our audience might be thinking,
Yeah.
right? So, like, okay, where was this just an agree to disagree? And then where was it not? And I'm curious if you have one sort of general example that you'd be able to give to speak to that while, of course, maintaining the confidentiality for the family.
Yeah, I think the line is crossed when the hearts of the people involved are so weighed down by the spiritual manipulation of the scriptures that there's no hope, and there's only a few ways out: run away or pass away, basically. um so if that's I don't know if that's as specific as I can get, but the idea is that, when there's not an open line to communication, especially in family, back and forth, to have respectful dialogue. And that's not to say that you shouldn't submit to your parents, or honor your father and mother. Absolutely, you should. But sometimes that honoring comes in saying, I'm not sure where the scripture says that. Can we have a conversation about that? Especially as kids get older. Um, the parents disciple the kids, and my kids do that to me sometimes, where I'll say something, they'll be like, Dad, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's dishonoring. Um, and so I think that's kind of where the line crosses, is when that leadership turns into this control to find conformity rather than discipleship. Uh, Now we're not actually leading our kids as believers, we're trying to get them to look a certain way to feed our own image, our facade that we've created and erected. And I think when that line is crossed, it is the duty of other faithful Christians to say, to step in and say, I don't think the discipleship that's happening here is beneficial for the church or for your family, and we need to step in. So I don't know if that makes sense, but um, yeah,
Yeah, I think it does. And I'm going to apply that to myself in order to give us an example that I know
yeah,
I can give because it's my own story, so I can give it. So when I think back to, well, and let me double check this. I believe you're referencing teenagers,
yes,
correct?
yep.
At
At
the
the time,
time.
hmm
Right. So I just want to clarify that too for everyone. We're not 5, 6 year olds. It would be just there'd be a different nuance to the
absolutely.
conversation because we'd be engaging them differently, of course, at that age versus teens who are attending youth group and have questions and are speaking and
hmm
sharing, what their story is, what their suffering is looking like, and the need that they have. And is anyone going to step in and help us? And I resonate with what you shared about, okay, I have two options here. I can either run away, and what's that, like, where am I going to go? How am I going to support myself? Is the church probably isn't going to be able to help me if they've already said no, and that's why I'm running away, because they're kind of, supporting the parents. So I can do that, which that can land in all sorts of awful places. We can talk about
hmm
trafficking, we can talk about homelessness. There's a lot of stuff at risk there, of course. And then the other option of taking one's own life. So I remember when I was 17, I finally hit this breaking point of enough is enough, and I can't do this anymore, and I'm not going to. And I actually went to my father and had a conversation with him, which is so crazy to think about because I'm just terrified of this
Yeah.
man, right? And I mean, abusive in all of the ways. And I remember knocking on his door, which was like one of the most fearful things to do, and walking in. And I basically kind of let him have it, my version of that. I'm like
hmm
shaking, and I'm, like 17-year-old Naomi learning how to be assertive for the first time with the scariest person she's ever known, and shaking and crying and like, you don't deserve to be called my father because you haven't been a dad. Like maybe some biological thing, but like this is how you've behaved and it's unacceptable. And I remember before I went in to have that conversation, I told my mom something had just happened. I can't remember what it was, but something had just happened where he had behaved horribly. And he had gone back in his room, and I had told my mom, like, I'm gonna either this stops now or I'm leaving. And I don't know if you'll see me again. And so we can hit that point of, some people could be like, well, that's rebellious or that's whatever. I think anyone who knows my story would say differently. But there's a real capacity limit
Mm.
to what a heart, soul, mind, body can bear, and to choose to be in that environment any longer than one has to. All of a sudden, it's like, I'm doing it to myself. And so, what are my possible outs? Now, if I had left, I don't know what I would have done. I mean, I had definitely thought about taking my life before, for sure. And so this really resonates again with me. Like, what are my options? And so, for anyone who's in that kind of situation, if I had had someone from outside of my family walls who could have put out a hand and given me a lifeline, that would have changed
Mm.
everything. And I just couldn't in good conscience say that you shouldn't have done that. Now, I don't know all the details, and we're not going to get into all the details. And I don't know what mistakes were made. And I appreciate that you said, yeah, I mean, it wasn't like sin, not on the level of like that was sinful and you need to be terminated, but just like, yeah, I'm kind of living and learning and trying to figure this out. And I would have maybe said that differently, or I would have
Yep.
maybe gone about that in this way instead of that way, or whatever, had a conversation with this person first, or whatever those kind of, details look like, which matter. But the risk that you would have taken, I feel so thankful on behalf of, thinking about myself, that there's people who would do that there's people who would take the risk to give someone that lifeline and to share with them the truth of who Jesus really is. Well, yes, of course, we want to honor and respect our parents to the ability that we have to do so. I mean, how I still had that conversation respectfully. I wasn't yelling at him.
Mm.
I wasn't, even when I say let him have it, I'm like, again, that was my version of letting him have it.
Yeah.
It was me being honest. It was just me being honest. And so, what tools do we have available to us? And I think part of the only reason I could do that was because I did have some outside voices from being in public school. Had I not been, I don't know if I ever would have done that at all. And so it's such a gift. And I'm grateful that you didn't turn away from it, even though it came at great risk for you. And ultimately, it did come at great cost to you. And I want to ask you a little bit more about
Yeah.
that piece as well. How did that go down? Was this, it sounded like you had a feeling, oh my gosh, this could be where it lands. I could lose my job.
Yeah, that was always a possibility because I knew that what I saw was kind of unique to where we just don't talk about it. If it was a different family that didn't homeschool or had obvious issues in their lives with drugs or things like that, I knew exactly what I should do. I knew the leadership would be behind me, those sorts of things. But I knew that um, this was different because there was a good reputation established here um, on purpose. And if I'm going to upset that apple cart, there's a lot of nuance to, like we've discussed. Uh, there's a lot of nuance to where those lines cross. In fact, I had heard the girl say at one time, I wish it was physical abuse so I could show people bruises and things like that so that they would believe." Um, and that just broke my heart because it's like spiritual abuse is, even if you don't realize you're doing it. And there's part of me that still doesn't think, that still thinks the family doesn't and didn't realize that that's actually what was happening. Um, and the church's inability to call it what it is doesn't help. Just saying that it's a rift or something like that doesn't actually help disciple people in that direction if they're willing to be discipled. I don't know if that would have been the case or not. Um, but I did sense that this could go poorly for me specifically. And I do want to give credit to the leadership. I do think a lot of their responses were out of fear. Um, and my wife and I ended up going to a counselor after all of this that specialized and they actually the leadership of the church actually provided that opportunity for us. So I don't want to throw them under the bus because they were dealing with something they had never anticipated either. But there were some people within there that had their own agendas too, and because of that, I became the target to get things done the way they wanted to get them done. Um, and I realized that I had a decision to make, and probably the biggest mistake I made was trying to thread the needle, trying to make enough decisions to kind of placate so that I could maintain my position, and then enough decisions to make sure I was still there for these young women in this family. And for me, that's the biggest mistake was I didn't just come out and trust that God would have the situation if I stood for what I knew was right 100% of the time. And so I would equivocate a little bit so that I could uh, maintain that possibility of staying on. Um, and who knows, it might have ended up where I would have been let go sooner, but it ended up where I was let go anyway. So I think my conscience would have been more clear, if that makes sense. Because as I think back, those are the things that I regret the most is when I tried to thread that needle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that idea of sort of walking that line. And I completely understand why you would. And I think a lot of people will because the Just the pure like, okay, yeah, it's my paycheck and I have a family. And that is scary. And it's threatening. And it doesn't mean the organization intends it to be threatening. It's just the nature of being on staff somewhere. But there's definitely a threatening aspect to that of, oh my goodness, okay, Lord, you're going to provide,
Yeah.
right? So the faith that is required, and yeah, it's tough. It is. And also when you're talking about something like spiritual abuse, and I want to second what you said, the girl said is heartbreaking of a statement of that was about the physical abuse and having bruises. Spiritual abuse is a lot harder for people to understand because it's this intangible form of abuse. And so it can feel more slippery for people. There's more questions around, well, what is it? And does this actually constitute that? And why the word abuse? Abuse is a strong word. And so it's like, okay, well, how do we know when it's crossed into abuse versus, okay, maybe that just wasn't great or it was hurtful. Maybe it's a more church hurt-esque,
Yeah.
versus full on abuse. I argue both matter. And yet it's tough. It's easier because of that for people to excuse it. It reminds me of, I was in a pretty significant auto accident back in 2016 and I didn't have any broken bones, but I had a TBI. So I had a traumatic brain injury and quite a few like physical injuries. It was about a 3.5 year healing process. And with 10 therapies a week while I was going through it. It was pretty brutal. And I remember when I was speaking to the lawyer because it didn't ultimately go to court. We were able to settle, but I had been rear-ended. And of course, the insurance doesn't want to pay for 3.5 years of medical care. So you got to kind of fight a bit to get that covered, get those bills covered. And I remember my legal team being like, it would have been better had you broken some bones. It's harder to show a brain injury. It's harder to prove the kind of suffering that you've had. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. I mean, so just because you can't show it on a picture, you can't, I don't have an x-ray that shows it. And it all worked out great. We were able to settle, the bills got covered and it all was fine at the end of it. But spiritual abuse, it reminds me of that. It's because there isn't this physical indicator that's so easily seen. And yet I would argue when we look at the effects of trauma on the body, we look at the physiological effects, it can be seen. People just aren't necessarily going to go for that kind of testing. They're not necessarily going to have, an MRI done of their brain when they're thinking about the situation, and they're not going to, but we can absolutely see what people are going through. We can see the signs of the stress that they've been under. And so I would push back on it a bit, but it's not the same as the physical. Absolutely. And I would implore the church to consider this. We are faith-filled people, right? We are believing, we are banking on the unseen. Yeah. We're basing our lives on the unseen. And so why don't we have faith in someone's story when they come forward and say, I'm being victimized and I don't have a physical bruise that I can show you? Why don't we sit down and hear them? Because maybe we need to believe what we can't fully see in that situation. I wish that we would at least consider it.
Yeah. And I think for me, when you're dealing with teenagers, it can be hard too. And one of the things I said was, I had a pretty established track record. I said, I've been in youth ministry for 10 years, and this is the first time anything like this has remotely happened. And so that was an appeal to say, unless all of a sudden something snapped in my brain and all of a sudden I wanted to do this, something else is going on here. Because I think some people, and rightfully so, because of the way our culture and society is, they look at teens and they say, well, they're immature and sometimes they're emotional and their responses are not reasonable. And there's a lot of situations, I say more often than not, situations are like that, where teens are just not quite sure what's actually happening, right? But then there are the situations where they've had to grow up really fast because of the things that are happening to them, and they had to learn to cope and create skills to pretend to be okay and to look a certain way, so that they could guard themselves from being hurt by other people too. and seeing that was pretty hard, because you could see that hard outer shell of, I'm just going to look okay, and then if I get through this, I can breathe later tonight when I'm by myself, that sort of thing.
Do you mind? And you can
Yeah.
defer if you don't want to answer this. I completely respect that. What ultimately did they say they fired you for?
Yeah. Well, I can get into that because that's just about me. So, so I'm
Okay.
fine with that. So basically, the idea was um, that they didn't feel I could be effective in ministry anymore there because of the past. There were too many people that were harboring resentments, and they didn't think I could be fruitful, and that I needed to go somewhere else to be fruitful in ministry and not have this weighing on me. And so I certainly could see part of that. Where I disagreed with that was, uh, I thought that was more of a projection than a reality. Um, and that I knew, and maybe they didn't, but I knew that this was always going to, no matter where I went, the nature of the people that I was dealing with, and how intimately I now understood where this came from and what this was. I knew that no matter what I did, no matter where I went, there would be a certain following of it with me, just because of the nature of the event. So no matter what I did, even the thing I'm doing now, um, there are, uh, for instance, I was going to speak at a church, and there were people that reached out to the church, and then I end up getting disinvited from the church just to speak there because they're concerned about the optics of it because of some of the things that happened. And I I know that other things like that have happened, and so I knew that that was always going to follow me. Um, and I think they thought, well, if he could get away from here, he can be free and restart and be renewed. Um, and maybe that would be the case if I moved to Alaska or something. I don't know, but I knew that I didn't feel God calling me out of where I was living, and so I knew that was going to follow us around. So that was what was said to me as to why. Now, whether or not that was the actual reason, sometimes I have doubts, but I can just go with what was given to me.
So, with that being said, was it somewhat amicable?
Like, I still have a good relationship with some people back there, somewhat amicable. I did say to them when we left that if they were not, because they wanted to announce it as I was resigning, um, and I said, uh, I know this might hurt my prospects of getting a position somewhere else, but I don't feel comfortable lying about the situation so that I can have easier time on my resume. This isn't what is happening. You are asking me to. You are telling me I have to step down and I don't have a future here, and people deserve to know that that's the case. So, and they said, you're right. That's fine. And so that's what they did. So what was amicable, we didn't agree, if that makes sense. So um,
Mhm.
there's not resentment that I harbor, but disappointment still sometimes.
Now that you are, well, you said this was post COVID. What year were you
Well, it
terminated?
was it was during it was 2020, so October 2020.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. So, I mean, great time to be on unemployment if you were
yeah,
going
and
to
they
be
gave me
with the bonuses they gave.
they did give me a package for a while I was looking for another position, and I ultimately found one God
Okay.
provided. I do remember afterwards joking with my wife that all I wanted to do was go work at Costco and and never be on church staff or do ministry ever again, because that's how painful this was. But the counselor that we were going to disabused me of that notion. They said, "Are you running to something or from something? Um, because if you're running to an opportunity to glorify God in this area, go for it. But if you're just running from your pain, you're going to deal with it eventually anyway. So let's lean into it. And so that was really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's going to come out, even if it's a decade, 20 years, whatever it is down the road. We look back and we're like, wow, that's actually been influencing
Yeah.
me the whole time. So I'm glad you had someone that was able to come alongside you so quickly and help you navigate those decisions. It's great when we're able to connect with someone early on. So you wanted to go work at Costco. You ended up back in
Yeah.
ministry. And what a loss, what a tragedy it would have been had you not, because the last thing that the church needs is everyone who will stand up and speak to get silenced and then to walk away.
Mhm.
And again, I don't say that with the lack of compassion, empathy, understanding of what people go through when they speak up. As someone who speaks up, like, we go through things because we do it, and we can take a lot of heat, a lot of pushback for it. People can cast judgment, fill in blanks with their own stories that are totally untrue and never even ask us what the truth is. And we deal with that. And yet it's needed for the sake of the people who are surviving. And it's also needed for the bride of Christ, for what the church is supposed to look like and who we're representing and who we're seeking to glorify. And so while I would have also said I completely understand if you were working at Costco, I'm glad that you're not working at Costco while you have this other desire in your heart and these other strengths that you have.
Thanks.
But I completely understand wanting to say, just forget the whole thing. I'm just going to be quiet with my faith, have a nice quiet faith in my home with my family, and I'm not going to do this anymore. And that's what can happen, right? As we speak up and then people try to silence us for speaking
Mhm.
up. It sounds like ultimately what happened is people, and I'm saying this to see if you can reflect back,
Yeah.
like, am I grasping it or not? It sounds like other families, other members of the congregation knew at least bits and pieces of things. And maybe they had made up their own stories and kind of filled stuff in. And there was some maybe chit chat back and forth. And so people came to their conclusions based on incomplete information. And not everybody, of course, was in your corner. And so that's why it was deemed that you would not be able to be fruitful there. There were people who were basically shut down to you and maybe against you and the way you had come alongside the girls in the family.
Yeah. Yeah. The way it was worded was your ministry will always be under a microscope. So just waiting for you to slip up so that we could pounce, which I can say, yeah, probably. But I think the difference was for me, I knew that, and maybe this is just me being idealistic. I don't know, but as I was going through counseling with it, I realized I can't live my life caring about other people's judgment. I have to live my life caring about what God is going to say about how I'm living and being faithful. And if I'm going to do ministry that way, and if people want to have me under a microscope and accuse me of things, that's their prerogative. But I'm going to do ministry the way God's equipped me to do ministry. Um, but you have to have both sides to agree that that's the waters we're willing to row against. And I think that that's where the disagreement was.
Right. And yeah, I can see where they're
Hmm.
coming from. It sounds like in a way they were honestly trying to make it easier, um, to make it maybe a bit cleaner and maybe easier for all parties involved. And yet it gives this sort of admission to fault is the appearance, I think. No matter what is said, I have a hard time believing that's not the impression that would be given. And so it can go a long way when we as a church come alongside people who have stood up. If we don't actually believe that they're wrong, then let's do the harder thing and stand beside them.
Yeah.
if they're willing to do the harder thing too and keep standing there, knowing that they're going to keep having, Rotten Tomatoes thrown at them throughout the healing process.
Yep.
Okay. When you think about how this was handled, what would you see as like the main sort of tenet of the ministry's leadership culture, like the church's priority? Like, what do you think was most valued?
I think there's a few things. I think keeping the peace. Our counselor that my wife and I went to had the saying of, "Are you a peacekeeper or a peacemaker?" Because a peacemaker is not afraid of making waves in order to accomplish true peace, and a peacekeeper is going to acquiesce and placate so that there's not conflict. Um, and so I think I saw there's a lot of peacekeeping that was happening to say, if we could just do this, if we could just do that, maybe the situation would cool down and we can just go ahead with ministry, because we don't want to deal with the conflict. So I think that was part of it. I do think one of the values was truth and wanting to maintain um, openness and truth with the congregation, but that bucked up against the value of family kind of autonomy and especially family values of headship of the family and things like that. So not being able to step in and do church discipline, or at least say words that would, you don't have to tell the whole story, but say we've investigated and we've said this, we used the word abuse because that's what we found. um, the hesitancy to say that, I think, came from fear of this conflict, even maybe a fear of a lawsuit or something like that, and not wanting to have to deal with that. Uh, so I think there were multiple things kind of at war, those main tenets. Um, Sometimes it was, no, we really want to fight for truth and make sure that this family's well taken care of. And I think sometimes it was, um, yeah, but we want to make sure that we don't make too many waves, and say things that we don't know all the details about. So we're just going to leave that where it is. So I think those two things were kind of in conflict, which is why it played out the way it did. So hopefully that makes sense. But that's kind of the way I saw it play out in my mind. And maybe they would say something different. But that's the way I saw it.
And how has it been since you've left? Now, you mentioned that you were disinvited from a speaking event. What about those who seem to more so care to protect you in ways, whether that was really truly what happened or not with you losing your job? I don't necessarily agree that it was truly protecting you, especially if you weren't asking for that kind of protection. But is there any contact at this point? Were you hung out to dry basically after you were terminated, or is there some support and some people still saying like, yeah, no, that's not what happened? Do you feel like you have any backing, any sense of community there?
Yeah, I actually think that, and you probably know this, but a lot of the people who were very upset ended up leaving anyway, ended up leaving the church anyway. So I actually think if our family went back to church and attended there this Sunday, there would be a lot of people that would be happy to see us and would invite us back and in. And we keep in contact with a few families. We don't have animosity, or we don't sense animosity from many families from there. In fact, we sense support from a lot of them. A lot of them just didn't know, what does that even look like. We're not sure, what it looks like. I know there's a lot of confusion, and even some of the leadership there still we keep in contact and that sort of thing. So I would say, by and large, for the ordeal that we went through, to maintain some of those relationships is unique, and something that I do cherish. It's not that we're close anymore, really, um, but I do feel like they're people that I could talk to. So
Mm. Being a bit removed from it now, being a few years out, having the support to process through what the experience was, what have you taken with you from it? Like if you were to be on staff at a church again, which I know is not your plan,
Yeah.
but if that were to happen and you came up against something, like what would you do differently? What would you do the same? What would you want to say to others?
Yeah. No, that's good. I've actually thought a lot about this because, as you probably know, we replay the situations in our mind 1 million times all the time, trying to figure out if there were other things that could have been said or done. Um, and so I've come to a few conclusions. One is that while I would maintain a concern for my family, I wouldn't be so concerned about the monetary or physical side of things, but the spiritual, like leading well spiritually through it with the family, rather than just wanting to maintain um, a position so that we could put food on the table. God was going to provide, and I think that showed a lack of faith on my part um, to do that. As understandable as it may be, uh, I think for me, I've become more willing to stand up and say the thing. Perhaps this is God stealing me for the position I'm in now to say a lot of things that are not culturally acceptable, and to shrug off the pushback to know that what I'm trying to do is honor God. And at the same time, it's a unique thing too, because I also have a genuine heart for people who have gone through spiritual abuse and church hurt and have sought to deconstruct their faith. And I think sometimes as churches, while we demonize certain movements, and rightfully so, we tend to not meet people where they're at. And so, if there was one thing I would say is, if there's somebody that's deconstructing or talking about deconstructing, there could be a long history of things that have happened in their life. It might not just be that they want to live a sinful lifestyle. It might be that they have been so hurt um, by people they thought they were supposed to trust and love, and that we're supposed to love them. And as churches, when we treat it as a political or just an ideological issue on a person to person basis, um, that's when we miss an opportunity to actually minister to people and help them reconstruct their faith that's God in a way that's God honoring. Um, and so that's a lot of what I want to do. And the two girls that part of that family are living lives involved in churches. They love the Lord. They haven't strayed. And not to say, I don't want to say that I'm the reason at all, because I think God is the one uh, that maintained that relationship with them. But I do think the idea that someone could walk through that situation and give time for questions, working out hurt, um, while at the same time maintaining the truth of the scriptures the way that they are, uh, is beneficial. And I think we see too many times we see it as, well, we need to be completely against what the left is pushing, no matter what. Um, and we turn all these personal conversations into culture wars when they're actually just personal conversations with people who might not even be involved in like a cultural war sort of mindset, but have just been disaffected and hurt. And that's where Christ can meet them. So I think that's some things that I'm carrying with me in ministry, a heart of empathy, and also a heart of understanding to say, some people just don't know how to respond to um, this sort of this sort of thing because they've never seen it, which is part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation, is because I haven't talked about this much on my own platform and things of that nature. It's a very sensitive topic, and it can be risky to do so, but it's important for churches to take those steps in that direction. So those are, I think, some of the keys that I carry with me, being more stalwart and having a more understanding and less rigid heart when it comes to matters of people struggling with their faith because of these sorts of things.
Well, and part of the conversation I've been having lately, more on a one-on-one basis, so not publicly like this, but we go through things for a first time. we all first time, experiences where it's like, oh, I haven't really had to navigate this before. And so we try our best. And I encourage organizations to reach out for help in navigating it, because then we can have less damage on the other side. So we want to minimize that, because the damage is going to be to people. And that's the biggest kind of damage we can have, is to people made in the image of God. We don't want to do that. And so reaching out and saying, okay, I'm navigating this for the first time. What are some things I should be considering? And there are organizations that help to do that. And so it's a message I'm hoping to get out, so that churches become more aware of, if we're going through something for the first time, we can be resourced to go through it. And that way we can hopefully do it better than we would have. Maybe still won't do it 100%, but we can hopefully do it a lot better, because we're talking to people who have done it before. And so let's learn from them, because again, this isn't just like collateral damage. We're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about their relationships with their faith too. So it's of the utmost importance. We want the utmost care. I think it kind of, I think I'm giving the benefit of the doubt here, and I could be wrong. I really believe that the reason many churches would not reach out is because they don't know that support exists, and they wouldn't know where to reach out to. I really think that's a massive part of it. I don't think it's, the uglier side of just not caring. Now, I know those situations happen. Those are the pastors that we tend to end up seeing, on the news and in journals and things like that. But generally speaking, I think it's just not really knowing what's out there. Maybe not even knowing the language for what's going on to even know what to put into Google.
Yeah.
So hopefully this education continues to get out and people feel better equipped, and they know that they can reach out for support. I wanted to ask you one last question. If you were to share a word of caution to your pastoral colleagues just across the globe, people listen to this from all over the world, in hopes of them never finding themselves in a similar situation, what would you want them to be aware of, or what would you want them to consider?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One is what you just said, that look for resources. That was one thing that I should have done. I thought, well, I'm a pastor. I should be able to navigate this and figure it out. There's lots of wisdom. The Bible's right there. But look for resources when you start to see these sorts of things, to say, okay, how best to navigate with somebody that's going through this, or with a family that looks this way, but as you peel back the curtain, you see some of the ugly underbelly of what's going on there. So not doing it alone, and inviting other people to speak into it, and also to not just look for threats to your congregation or to the people that you're leading from without your church, but to recognize that sometimes we can create an environment within our church, whether that's because of the things that we don't talk about, or because of we think that if everyone votes the same way, or talks the same way, or schools the same way, they have the same values, they see the Bible the same way. We don't realize that there are people that might be doing things in plain sight. And generally speaking, I feel like that's what a lot of what happens when you see some church abuse scandals, is people go, oh, we had no idea, because they've been a well-respected person in here for so many years. And to say, well, the guest that's coming in, probably less of a threat than some people that are actually there. And that's not to say you need to look at all of your parishioners or congregants under suspicion, but I think we do need to have the willingness to have open eyes and open ears and open hearts to say, when I hear something that, or see something that sounds off, whether it's leadership or somebody in the church, not so that I can meddle and interfere in all the different families, but I can keep my eye on something and say, and then have a conversation with people. Say, do you see the same thing I'm seeing? And if that's the case, how should we respond? Because I think sometimes we're so concerned about the culture's influence on the church, we don't realize that there's something growing right underneath our feet.